Good morning, gang. Bob DeVance for the Dressler Bible Fellowship Group for May the 2nd of 2021. As you probably have noticed, we're continuing to go through the latter chapters of the book of Luke. Today we're still in chapter 22, and we will continue in chapters 22, 23, 24, basically until we finish the book at the end of May. So this is, I think, a good study, going into it in some depth and detail about the things that Jesus went through for the crucifixion, leading up to the crucifixion, as well as the crucifixion itself, of course. So we'll be doing some of that today as well. We're picking up essentially where we left off last week. We talked about the institution of the Lord's Supper, which Jesus did at the Passover time last week. And then we pick that up today once they've left the Lord's Supper area and go out to the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where we're basically picking it up today. So with that, let's just dive right in. The lesson writers chose to use the title Willing today for the lesson, and the point being that Jesus was willing to go to the cross. I don't recall which of the Gospels it is, but Jesus says, "Didn't you know I could have called 12 legions of angels to come and rescue me from this?" But that was not God's will for his life. And he didn't do that, even though he had that at his disposal, had he chosen it. 12 legions. That's a lot. A legion was 6,000 soldiers in the Roman world. So 12 times 6 would be, what, 72? That's a lot. 72,000 angels. He could have called it at the drop of a pin, as it were. But he didn't. He was willing to do his Father's will. And I think the lesson for us from that today is that we likewise need to be willing to do what God has called us to do in the way we live our lives, the holiness of our lives, as well as to tell others about Jesus in word and in deed, the way we live. So with that, here we go. What do we know about the cross? Well, we know it's horrendous. It's terrible. It was set up by the Roman government as a means of making a point, shall we say. To those who cross Rome, you can expect this. That was the idea behind it. Some other things, if you have the notes, and I hope you do, have those printed out and before you there. I've listed 5 things there about the cross that to me stand out. Number one, the actual crucifixion was usually preceded by a flogging. Many people died from the flogging and never got to the crucifixion. That was so severe. It was horrendous. The one to be crucified then was to carry his crossbeam of the cross out to the place where the crucifixion was to occur. And of course, many were not able to do that. They had to have help to do that. They were so weakened from the flogging, they weren't able to make it all the way out to the place of crucifixion. Maximum pain was intended to the victim. That was part of the design of it, was to show as much suffering as possible. Nails through the tender parts of the hands and the feet. Some doctors have said they cross certain nerves which cause sharp, fiery pain, excruciating pain to go throughout the body. A horrific shock from all of this, which would lead to an unbearable thirst, and nothing you can do about it, of course, when you're nailed to a cross. Then attacks by insects. The insects would come and attack the body on the cross, and there's no way you could fight those insects off. You had no defense from that. And finally, of course, death by asphyxiation. When the victim became so exhausted that he could no longer raise himself on the nails in his feet, he would die by asphyxiation. He couldn't breathe out, basically. And then crucifixion was done in a public place to provide maximum humiliation for the ones being crucified. And that would set an example to others. Don't cross Rome. This is what Roman justice looks like. Don't cross us. And then last, once the victim died, unless someone stepped forward to take the body from the cross and bury it, it would not even receive a burial. It would be thrown into what we would call today the city dump, the trash heap. And it would be left there to rot and or to burn with the rest of the garbage that burned in that trash heap day and night. So that's what Jesus was looking at when he looked at going to the cross. My mind really can't comprehend that. That's just more than I can handle. And yet that's what Jesus was dealing with. And he knew this. What do you think was his greatest dread? I started to use the word fear, but perhaps I think fear is not the right word. His greatest dread about all of this. Was it the physical abuse and the pain and the suffering which he knew he was going into? Was that the main thing? I really don't think so. 2 Corinthians 5:21, Paul says, for he, talking about God here, God made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him, or through Jesus himself. Jesus was the sinless Son of God, God in the flesh here on this earth, and yet he took upon the sin of all the world. Could his greatest dread have been the knowledge that he was going to be separated from his Father for a period of time there, while he bore the sins of the world on his body? He took all of that onto himself, loaded himself up with my sin and your sin and the sins of the whole world. And as he did that, God turned his face away from him and he experienced separation, something he had never done before. I wonder if that wasn't a greater dread than the physical suffering, which certainly was very, very real, as we said. Knowing all that, though, he willingly went on to the horror of the cross to provide salvation for me, for you, and for all mankind. What a Savior. Today we're going to look at the anguish that he experienced while he prayed and he contemplated all these things that are coming up, the things which lay ahead of him for the next day, following the day, or the day and the night of the Lord's Supper. Looking ahead to what was coming. Picking it up at Luke chapter 22, verse 39. Technically, the lesson is supposed to start in 41, but 39 and 40 we need as part of the lead-in to where we're coming in here. It says, and coming out, that is coming out from Jerusalem and out from the house where they had had the Lord's Supper, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, as he was accustomed. This was a place where he often went. John 18:1 and 2 elaborates on that further. It said, when Jesus had spoken these words, again talking about his time at the Mount of Olives, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden. Other Gospels say it was the Garden of Gethsemane, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this was a place known to all of them, a place where Jesus went often, it seems. And so Luke says, as he was accustomed, this is where he went. And his disciples also followed him, which is an interesting comment. When he came to the place, he said to them, pray. Now we would think he would be saying, pray for me in this hour of anguish, but instead he said, pray for yourselves. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. And we know from going into the scriptures that being tempted itself is not a sin. The sin arises from yielding to the temptation and going into whatever that temptation calls for. Jesus himself was tempted. He's going to be tempted right here tonight. Satan is working overtime and hard to try to get Jesus not to go to the cross, not to do what his Father's will is for him in this matter, in providing salvation for the world. It's interesting how Jesus comes out of this on the other side after the temptation, and how his followers come out on the other side after the temptations that they are submitted to. Okay, so anyway, as we said, Jesus has gone to the Garden of Gethsemane. His followers have gone with him, a place where he went often. Of course, this was the place that Judas knew he would be. And of course, Judas is going to lead the arresting mob there to arrest Jesus a little bit later on in our reading here. It says that the disciples followed him, but did they really follow him? Did they really have a sense of what was going on this night, of how heavy this was? how Jesus was in such agony as he wrestled with what was to come. You remember back in Mark 8:34, Jesus said, when he had called the people to himself, with his disciples also, so they heard this, of course, too, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Going back to the cross again, you recall the cross was the sign of death, the emblem of death. Today we wear crosses as jewelry. We have crosses as decoration on our walls in our homes oftentimes. Churches have crosses above the church to signify that they're a place of the cross, that is, that they're a church honoring Jesus. But in that time, the cross was a horrific symbol of an awful death. And Jesus said, take up your cross. In other words, be willing to sacrifice it all as you follow me. Were the disciples willing to make that sacrifice? We'll see a little bit later when we get there. It's also interesting to note, as I said earlier, that Jesus asked his disciples to pray, but not for him, not for Jesus, but to pray for themselves that they wouldn't be taken down by the temptations that they were going to face, the issues that were going to come up here very shortly, actually, as Jesus is praying. You remember that all of his followers fled later on. They certainly needed to have prayed for deliverance from that temptation, that they would have stood with Jesus one way or the other. Going on, 41 and 42 says, and he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw. How far is a stone's throw? I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 feet, something like that, a little ways further. And he knelt down and he prayed. And he said, Father, if it's your will, take this cup away from me. In other words, remove this suffering that's in front of me, which he calls the cup. Nevertheless, no matter what, though, not my will, but yours be done. I want to avoid the suffering, he says. But if it's your will for me to go on with this anyway, then I will do it. If there's any way around this, let there be a way around it. But again, if not, I will follow you. I am willing to follow. The other Gospels tell us other things about this, of course. They tell us that that Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to go closer with him into the area where he prayed, where the other disciples, apostles, were a little further back and behind him, perhaps. So these three were nearest to him, and then Jesus went a little bit further. It would seem that he wanted his closest associates there near to him for their support, but at the same time, he needed to go a little further in to have some private time to agonize in prayer with his Father. At least that seems to be the case. He needed that intimate communication with his Father in prayer. Knowing the physical agony and the separation from his Father that was awaiting him, Jesus asked his Father if there's any other way to fulfill the Father's will. Is there any other way to do this? Still, he was totally willing to face what lay ahead if the Father had no alternative, no plan B. And of course, he did not. Philippians 2:8, Paul says, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, and he became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. He totally humbled and yielded himself. You notice that he knelt down. That indicated total subservience before the Father. The classic position for prayer at that time was to stand. You'll recall the case where the publican and the Pharisee were in the temple area praying. They were both standing, which would have been the usual place, or usual posture for prayer. But Jesus here kneels in complete submission to the Father. But then, what about us today? How willing are we to do God's will in our lives today? 1 John 1:3-16, I think, gives an interesting insight here. John there says, By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. Jesus demonstrated that love for us because he laid down his life at the cross for us. We ought also to lay down our lives for the brethren. In other words, for each other. We will sacrifice to support each other. How much are we willing to lay down for Jesus' sake? Think about that one. Verse 43. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. That's an interesting observation. Man could not give Jesus the comfort, the consolation, the reassurance that he needed. And of course, they couldn't anyway because they were asleep, we know later. So God sent an angel. Now, this pattern is not that unusual when you look back at the Gospels. Numerous times, angels appeared to Jesus or appeared to make announcements on his behalf. You'll remember Gabriel came to Zechariah and prophesied the birth of John the Baptist, and then subsequently went to Mary and told her about the birth of Jesus himself, and also about the birth of John the Baptist. And then subsequent to that, when Jesus was born, you remember the angels appeared to the shepherds and made the announcement that the Messiah had been born. Early in Jesus' ministry, Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days where he was tempted by Satan. And afterwards, the angels came and strengthened him and ministered to him. You'll recall that. And now, in his final day, an angel is sent to bring a message from God. Remember, angels are messengers primarily. He brings a message apparently of hope and reassurance from God the Father to Jesus that this is God's will, this is his calling for him, and this is the plan that will be fulfilled. Going on, Luke 22:44. Being in agony. It's easy to skate over that, but it's being in agony, in deep, deep concern, agony over this whole thing. He prayed the more earnestly. He prayed with all his heart, soul, and being. Then his sweat became like, notice the word is like, not as, became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. His sweat was so heavy, it was like drops of blood, like it's trying to coagulate. Many have tried to make a case for the fact that he was in such agony that his capillaries in his brow and his face leaked or burst so that his sweat was actually tinted with blood. And I'm not going to say one way or the other. I don't know. Certainly that could have been the case. But Luke does say like great drops of blood and not as great drops of blood. Nonetheless, Luke is trying to show us the fervor with which Jesus was praying, the depth of the agony in his soul for which he was praying. His humanness did not want to go through with this. And as a human, I think I can empathize. I think I can understand that. How many times have we had something much less than that we have to face, and we agonize over it? For example, we may be going in for a medical procedure or surgery, perhaps, and it's terrifying. We agonize over it before we go into that with concern. But how much greater here what Jesus was going through, because he's dealing not with just himself and his future, but what he's going to do for the benefit of all of mankind. 45 and 46, when he rose up from prayer and he had come back to his disciples, he found them sleeping from sorrow, which is a very interesting term. Then he said to them, why do you sleep? Rise up and pray, lest you enter into temptation. His reminder that you need to be praying for yourselves that you don't stumble and yield to the temptations which are coming very shortly. The sleeping from sorrow, what is that? The other Gospels, by the way, record that this happened 3 times, that he went and came back 3 different times and found them asleep each time. Why were they so tired? Some translations say they were exhausted from grief. Was their mental state such that they had finally recognized what Jesus had been telling them all along, that he was going to suffer and die and be raised again. And they were sad over that. Remember, their mindset again was still that Jesus was going to restore the kingdom to Israel physically and literally as a political and a military leader. And now he's telling them that he's going to die and be raised again. Was that working on their hearts and minds? I don't know. One of the commentators explains it this way. He says, Luke explains why the disciples fell asleep. They were overcome by sorrow. They were utterly exhausted. Maybe Satan had lulled them to sleep as a balm or a salve for their woes. It was a strange, heavy sleep that held them so tightly. The Lord himself woke them up 2 or 3 times, but the moment his back was turned, they fell asleep again. The Lord rebuked them gently each time. His hour of temptation was over. Theirs was about to begin. He had won his battle on his knees. They were about to lose theirs by taking to their heels. That's from John Phillips. An interesting observation on why they were asleep, why the sleep was so heavy. And, I'd not thought about Satan entering into this, but why not? That Satan would have made this so heavy and so oppressive to them that they would try to gain sleep, to gain some relief from it. Perhaps so. And now we go on. 47 and 48. While he was still speaking to them, behold, a multitude. Several of the other Gospels again give us additional detail about that multitude. And he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them. That is, he went ahead of the multitude, and he drew near to Jesus to kiss him. We've talked about the kiss before. The kiss was a nice greeting, a way of saying shalom and showing that action. You would come up to the person you wanted to show respect to and kiss them on either one or both cheeks and say the word shalom or peace. Jesus said to him, though, Judas, calls him by name, you notice. And I believe it's in Matthew, he calls him friend even. He said, you are betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Jesus was aware totally of what Judas was doing. You recall, Jesus said to Judas at the Last Supper, what you do quickly. Go ahead. And Judas got up and went out into the night and consummated his deal with the religious leaders of the time to betray Jesus, to deliver him over to them. There were temple guards. There were some Roman soldiers there. Some of the Jewish leaders even was there, as Jesus will mention just a little bit later. John in 18:3 says there was a band of men. The word band that he uses there indicated 1/10 of a legion of Roman soldiers. You recall a legion of Roman soldiers, again, was about 6,000 men. So 1/10 of a legion would be 600 men. So we had all the temple guard with their swords and clubs, and some of the Roman soldiers there with their swords there, and of course the torches and such to light the night. What a multitude. I think Luke chose the right word for that. However large it actually was, we may not know for sure, but it was substantial. We know that for sure. The prearranged sign that Judas had set up, giving the kiss of peace, of course, Jesus already knew what that plan was. He knew what it was all about. And then in 49 to 51, Jesus makes his final comments here. When those around him saw what was going to happen, that is, the disciples around Jesus saw what was going to happen, they said to Jesus, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? You remember back in Luke 22:38, they said, we have 2 swords. And Jesus said, yeah, that's enough. That's enough. So they said, Lord, shall we put those to use now? Shall we strike with the sword? Shall we strike back to try to defend you? What a noble effort. These 11 guys are going to take on 600 plus soldiers and guards from the temple with swords and clubs, are well armed. And we know from the other Gospels that Peter was the one who took his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, who's named in one of the other Gospels. His name was Malchus. And he cut off his right ear, Luke being one to give detail, mentions the right ear. How did that happen? I suspect Peter was not aiming for his ear. He was aiming for his head, and he missed. I mean, these guys are fishermen and followers of Christ. They're not soldiers. Now, this is going to cause a lot of blood, a lot of anguish. The guy's going to be in great pain. What a mess. If Jesus had let it continue like that, as the others would come into view where they could see what's going on. Remember, they're all following, coming in, and they're using the torches, which don't give all that much light. There could have been a slaughter because of that. They could have said, oh my goodness, they're on the attack, so whip out the swords and attack back. And there could have been a massacre right there of the 11. But what does Jesus do? He said, you permit this. And he touched his ear and he healed him. He performed a miracle right there. It just says, and that's all it says, he touched his ear and he healed him. Did he pick up that ear from the ground and put it back on and heal, or did he just heal him? We don't know. It doesn't say. But he took care of it. And probably that prevented a real catastrophe from occurring right then. Well, it was a brave front, but to no avail, of course. Jesus was willing to go with this mob, so he took a quick action to keep the violence from happening and escalating. He was on his way to the cross. He knew that. And nothing was going to thwart that path to the cross that he knew was coming. And finally, 52 and 53. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders who'd come to him. So this is why we were saying, John says there was a band, a tenth of a legion that came out from the Roman cohort. But then there were the priests and the religious leaders and many of those who came out as spectators to see what was going to happen, perhaps, and to make sure that they saw justice done as they would have viewed it. But nonetheless, Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? I'm one guy here. Good grief, what is all this about? When I was with you daily in the temple, you didn't try to seize me. And of course, they had additional reasons for that, although they certainly could with a mob like that. It says several times that they wouldn't try to take him during the day because the crowds loved him and were around. They didn't want a mob from that. But with this kind of a mob, my goodness, they could have taken anybody. Then Jesus says something profound. This is your hour and the power of darkness. Satan is in control of this. He's guiding you in this. This is intended to happen, and it's happening according to God's plan. The irony of it all, isn't it? They could have arrested Jesus so many times, but they didn't because they were scared of the crowds. Now they come out with this army, basically, to arrest one violent man in the dead of the night. But Jesus understood what was going on. He knew what was happening. He knew the motivation behind it all. And it was time for him to move on toward the cross. Looking forward for just a moment, you'll recall that Jesus is crucified on Passover Day. So, he is the Passover lamb. A lot of prophecy here to be fulfilled. His obedience to fulfill his Father's will was absolutely unwavering. He never wavered. He never looked away. He never backed down. He went forward all the time. And you'll recall the calmness with which he approached all this. Even in his weakened condition following flogging and all those things, he was still in control. He was still in control of the situation. He was allowing it to happen. Let's see if we can summarize. Jesus was completely human and subject to the agonies of mankind. He's totally human. He's experienced the same thing as we. We're told that he was tempted in all points as we, and yet he was without sin in the book of Hebrews. Jesus was willing to go to the cross without wavering, without looking back, without looking for plan B. We are called then to follow him without wavering as well, with no reservation, to follow him, including death if that's what's required. Prayer was eminently important to Jesus. It should be of paramount importance for us also as we combat the forces of evil in our lives today. Speculating just a moment, would it have been different for the disciples if in fact they had been able to remain awake and in prayer during those times when Jesus was forward of them praying for himself? Don't know. It's an interesting thought, though, isn't it? We know the power of prayer and how important it is for us today. Ephesians 6:12 says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Satan is alive and well and working very hard. Hal Lindsey in his book used that title, Satan is alive and well on planet Earth. And he is. Colossians 1:13 and 14 says, Paul says, he delivered us from the power of darkness, though. He conveyed us into his kingdom, into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood and forgiveness of sin. I am so grateful that Jesus went to the cross without wavering, that he bore my sins on the cross on my behalf and in my place, to the extent that he was separated from the Heavenly Father for that period of time on the cross as he carried my sins. My sins were judged as he carried them. And when he came out of the grave, he gives me the opportunity to accept him as my Savior. And then his blood, which he has shed, covers my sins and makes me acceptable in the very presence of God the Father. How much we have to be thankful for. May God bless you this Sunday. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Don't forget to attend worship either in person or online, that the Lord might bless you. God bless you again. Have a wonderful day.